The air froze in 7-year-old Emily's lungs as 12 broad-shouldered Marines in crisp dress blues filed silently into her third-grade classroom, their faces solemn beneath their covers. Every morning for the past 3 years, rain or shine, the little girl with patched clothes and a heart too big for her tiny frame had shared her meager school breakfast with the quiet homeless veteran who sat on the same park bench, never knowing he had once commanded these very men standing before her now, or that his final letter would bring them across the country to fulfill a promise to the child who had shown him kindness when the rest of the world had turned away. What powerful secret had the homeless veteran been keeping all those years, and why had he chosen Emily's kindness as his last connection to a world that had forgotten him? Emily Monroe's small hand trembled as she extended half of her peanut butter sandwich toward the man on the bench. At just 4 years old, her worn sneakers barely touched the ground as she sat beside him, determined despite her mother's warnings about strangers. "You need to eat, mister," she said, her voice soft but insistent. The man, tall even when seated, with a rigid posture that never fully relaxed, stared straight ahead at first. His weathered face remained expressionless, his gray-flecked beard neatly trimmed despite his tattered clothes. After several uncomfortable moments, he accepted the offering with calloused hands. "Thank you," he murmured. The words so quiet, Emily almost missed them. Each morning after dropping Emily at Happy Horizons Elementary, Maggie Monroe rushed to her first cleaning job. This left Emily with 20 precious minutes before the school. Doors opened. 20 minutes she now spent sharing her breakfast. The man never asked for anything. Some days he wouldn't even look at her. But Emily noticed things adults missed: how he sat perfectly straight, how his shoes, despite being worn, were always clean and tied with precise knots, how, despite smelling of outdoors, he never reeked of alcohol like some of the other homeless people. "My name's Emily," she offered on the 5th day. "What's yours?" The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Jack," he finally said. No last name, just Jack. Other parents hurried their children past, throwing suspicious glances. Teachers frowned from the school entrance, but something about Jack's eyes, blue like faded denim, carrying a sadness deeper than Emily could understand, made her return day after day. Winter came, bringing bitter winds. Jack wore the same olive green jacket, now supplemented with a scarf Emily's mother had reluctantly let her give away. "Your old one," Emily had insisted, "the one you don't use." "Cold today," Emily observed one January morning, her breath clouding. "Between them," Jack nodded. "Been through colder." 3 words, more than he'd spoken in weeks. By spring, their ritual was established. Emily would sit, offer food, and talk about small things. Her drawings, the class turtle, how her mother worked. 3 jobs. Jack would listen, occasionally nodding. Sometimes, when other children passed too close or a car slowed suspiciously near Emily, his posture would shift subtly, eyes tracking potential threats. "Were you a soldier?" Emily asked once, noticing how he stood when a police siren wailed. Nearby, alert, ready. Jack's eyes flicked to her face, then away. "Once." Emily nodded, satisfied. Her kindergarten teacher had shown them pictures of Veterans Day parades. "That's why you sit so straight," she declared with the certainty of childhood. A ghost of a smile touched Jack's lips, the first Emily had seen, before vanishing back into the mask of stoicism he always wore. The park bench became their place. Through snow, rain, and brilliant sunshine, Jack was always there, as reliable as the crossing guard or the school bell. Emily noticed how he watched over her until she safely entered the school building, and how his eyes scanned for her each morning. Other homeless people avoided Jack's bench. Once, when a rough-looking man approached Emily as she waited, Jack had simply stood up. Something in his stance made the other man retreat without a word being exchanged. By the end of that first year, they had a language of few words, but mutual understanding. Jack was Emily's silent guardian, and she was determined to be his friend, even if he never fully acknowledged it. Seasons changed, and Emily grew. Winter gave way to spring, summer faded to fall, and their routine remained constant as the Earth's rotation. Emily turned 5, then 6, her small frame stretching upward as her face lost its baby roundness. Through it all, Jack remained a fixture on the bench, his beard growing grayer, but his posture never less straight. Maggie Monroe watched her daughter's friendship with the homeless veteran with cautious eyes. A single mother working endless hours cleaning houses and offices, she had little choice but to trust Emily's judgment about Jack. The school counselor had assured her they kept an eye on the situation, and a discreet background check by a sympathetic police officer had turned up nothing concerning about the quiet homeless man known only as Jack. "He protects me, Mom," Emily insisted one evening as Maggie rubbed cream into her cracked, work-worn hands. "Remember when those big kids tried to take my backpack? Jack just stood up and looked at them, and they ran away." Maggie sighed, brushing Emily's dark hair back from her forehead. "I know, honey. I just worry." Their apartment was small, one bedroom they shared, with walls thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments. The refrigerator hummed loudly, working too hard to stay cool, and the windows leaked cold air in winter. But Emily kept it cheerful with hand-drawn pictures taped to every surface. As Emily entered first grade, Jack began speaking more. Short sentences emerged between long silences. "Good drawing," he commented once, glancing at Emily's artwork. "Oh, stay." Colorful rendering of their bench with 2 stick figures. "It's us," Emily explained unnecessarily, beaming at him. When Emily caught pneumonia and missed 2 weeks of school, Jack noticed immediately. On her first day back, thin and pale, but smiling, he offered her half of an apple, perfectly sliced with what must have been a pocket knife. "For strength," he said simply. It was the first time he had given her anything. Emily accepted it with the solemnity of receiving a medal. By the time Emily reached second grade, they had developed subtle routines. If Jack sat on the left side of the bench, it meant he was having a good day and would talk. The right side meant silence was needed. Emily learned to read his moods with the intuition children often possess before adults teach them to ignore it. "My dad left when I was a baby," Emily confided one spring morning, watching a father help his son with a bicycle across the park. "Mom says he couldn't handle responsibility." Jack nodded, his eyes tracking the father and son as well. "Some men can't face themselves," he offered cryptically. Occasionally, Jack disappeared for a day or two. Emily would sit alone those mornings, saving her sandwich half until the last minute before school started just in case. He always returned, never explaining his absences. During her third grade year, Emily noticed Jack seemed more alert, almost anxious. His eyes scanned the park more frequently, and sometimes he would abruptly end their conversations when certain people walked by. "Are you afraid of something, Jack?" Emily asked directly one rainy Tuesday, his blue eyes, sharper than usual, fixed on her face. Not afraid, just watchful. That winter was particularly harsh. Emily convinced her mother to help her bring Jack a better coat, purchased from Goodwill with Emily's saved allowance. He accepted it with a nod that contained more emotion than many people's tearful speeches. "Gulf War," he said unexpectedly one morning, as Emily unwrapped her breakfast. "What?" she asked, confused. "You asked once where I served. First Gulf War, then Afghanistan." Emily nodded seriously, recognizing the gift of information for what it was. "Were you brave?" Jack's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, pain, memory, loss. "My men were," he answered finally. By the end of those 3 years, Jack and Emily had developed a bond that defied conventional understanding. He remained mysterious, offering only fragments of his past, but his protective presence never wavered. For Emily, he had become as much a part of her life as school itself, the quiet guardian who saw her, truly saw her, when so many adults were too busy surviving to notice. The Monday that changed everything dawned cold and gray. Emily hurried toward the park bench, her breath forming clouds in the February air, clutching her paper lunch bag containing 2 halves of a peanut butter sandwich. One for her, one for Jack, but the bench was empty. Emily stopped short, her small shoulders dropping in disappointment. Jack sometimes missed days, though rarely without some hint the day before. She glanced around the park, expecting to see his tall figure approaching from the public restrooms, or perhaps the coffee shop, where a kind barista occasionally gave him free coffee. Nothing. Emily sat alone, placing Jack's sandwich half on the bench beside her in their usual arrangement. She waited until the last possible minute before school, then carefully wrapped the uneaten portion and tucked it into her bag. Maybe he would be there after school. He wasn't, nor was he there Tuesday morning or Wednesday. By Thursday, Emily's worry had transformed into a constant knot in her stomach. She'd never gone so many days without seeing Jack. Even during the worst blizzard last year, he'd appeared, somehow making his way through 18 inches of snow to maintain their ritual. "Mom," she asked Thursday night as Maggie sorted through bills at their small kitchen table, "can we drive around and look for Jack?" Maggie looked up, dark circles under her eyes testifying to her latest overnight cleaning shift. "Oh, honey, the city's too big. He could be anywhere. But what if he's sick? What if he needs help?" Emily's voice quavered. Maggie set down her pen and pulled Emily into a hug. "We'll check the park again tomorrow, okay? And I'll ask Officer Ramirez if he's seen him." Officer Ramirez, a kind police officer who patrolled near the school, had kept an unofficial eye on Jack for years, partly to assure concerned parents and partly because he'd served in the military himself and recognized a fellow veteran in need. Friday. Morning arrived with a pale sun that did nothing to warm the air. Emily ran ahead of her mother, hope propelling her forward despite 4 days of disappointment. The bench remained empty. Emily's face crumpled. She placed the sandwich on the bench anyway, arranging it carefully on a napkin. "Honey," Maggie said, gently, "he might not come." "He might," Emily insisted, her chin jutting out stubbornly, "and he'd be hungry." Officer Ramirez approached as they were leaving, his breath visible in the cold. "No sign of him, Maggie. I asked around at the shelter and the VA." Nothing. Emily pretended not to hear, but her shoulders hunched forward under her backpack. The weekend passed in restless anxiety. Emily convinced her mother to drive to the park both Saturday and Sunday. Each time she left food on the bench, an apple, a granola bar, another sandwich half. Each time they returned hours later to find the food untouched, sometimes soggy, from light rain or picked at by birds. Monday marked a full week since Jack had disappeared. Emily went through her morning routine mechanically, her usual chatter silenced by worry. At the park, she sat on their bench, tears welling in her eyes. "He's gone, isn't he, Mom?" she whispered. Maggie sat beside her daughter, putting an arm around her thin shoulders. "I don't know, sweetie. People like Jack, sometimes they move." "On top of it without saying goodbye?" Emily's voice cracked. Maggie had no answer. Emily left no food that day. Something inside her, the wisdom children sometimes possess about the finality of certain absences, told her it would be futile. That afternoon she created a missing poster with her colored pencils, featuring a surprisingly accurate drawing of Jack's bearded face and watchful eyes. The school counselor, Ms. Peterson, helped her make copies. "Sometimes people who live on the streets have to move around," Ms. Peterson explained kindly as the copier hummed. "It doesn't mean he didn't care about you." Emily nodded, but her usual bright energy had dimmed to a flicker. For the next week, she and Maggie taped posters to lampposts and bulletin boards around the neighborhood. Officer Ramirez promised to keep looking. The kind barista from the coffee shop said she'd ask other customers. Still, no Jack. Emily continued visiting the bench every morning, sitting alone with her sandwich, but now she ate both halves herself. The empty space beside her yawned like a physical presence, a reminder that people could vanish from your life as suddenly as they had entered it. By the third week, Emily had stopped looking up eagerly each time she heard footsteps approach. The bench was just a bench again, cold, impersonal wood that held no answers to where her friend had gone or why he had left without a word. What Emily couldn't know was that across town, in a sterile hospital room, a man known to the staff only, as John Doe had been admitted with severe pneumonia and no identification except a worn photograph of a little girl sitting on a park bench, carefully protected in a waterproof bag inside his coat. A month after Jack's disappearance, Emily had settled into a new normal. She still glanced at the empty bench each morning, but the sharp pain had dulled to a persistent ache. She'd started eating breakfast in the school cafeteria with her classmates instead of alone in the park. Her mother watched her carefully, concerned by her daughter's newfound quietness, but relieved to see small smiles returning. Wednesday afternoon found Emily focused on her math worksheet, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. When a knock interrupted the class, Mrs. Winters, her third-grade teacher, opened the door and spoke in hushed tones with someone in the hallway. Emily, like her classmates, craned her neck curiously. "Emily," Mrs. Winters called, her voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. "Could you come here, please?" 24 pairs of eyes tracked Emily as she stood and made her way to the front of the classroom. In the hallway stood a tall man in an expensive-looking gray suit. His hair was neatly combed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He carried a leather briefcase that matched his belt. "Hello, Emily," he said, his voice gentle but formal. "My name is Mr. Davidson. I'm an attorney. Could we speak privately for a moment?" Emily looked uncertainly at Mrs. Winters, who nodded encouragingly. "You can use the reading corner," Mrs. Winters suggested, gesturing to a carpeted area separated from the main classroom by a low bookshelf. "I'll be right over here." Emily followed Mr. Davidson to the reading corner, her heart thumping oddly. She'd never spoken to an attorney before. Was she in trouble? Had something happened to her mother? "Please sit down," Mr. Davidson said, lowering himself onto one of the small chairs with some difficulty. His knees jutted up comically, but his expression remained serious. "Am I in trouble?" Emily blurted. The attorney's face softened. "No, not at all. I'm here about your friend, Jack." Emily's breath caught. "You know Jack. Did you find him? Is he okay?" Mr. Davidson placed his briefcase on the small table between them. "Emily, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Jack, or rather Colonel Jonathan Harrington, passed away 3 days ago." The words didn't make sense at first. They hung in the air like strange birds, foreign and incomprehensible. "Passed away?" Emily repeated, her voice small. "He died," Mr. Davidson clarified gently. "He had been very sick with pneumonia. The doctors did everything they could, but his body was already weakened from years of—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "From years of difficult living conditions." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "But, Colonel?" His name was Jack. "Colonel Jonathan Jack Harrington," Mr. Davidson explained. "He was a highly decorated Marine Corps officer. He served our country for over 20 years. Emily's mind whirled with confusion. Jack was a colonel? The homeless man who sat silently on her bench, who accepted half sandwiches and barely spoke, had been an important military leader? "How did you know to find me?" she asked, a tear slipping down her cheek. Mr. Davidson opened his briefcase and removed a file. "Colonel Harrington made me his legal representative years ago, before he hesitated again, before he chose to live on the streets. He maintained a small safety deposit box where he kept important documents. When the hospital contacted me about his condition, I went to see him. He was very weak, but he gave me clear instructions about what to do when he was gone." Emily wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "What instructions?" "He wanted me to find you," Mr. Davidson said simply. "He described you very precisely, a small girl with dark hair and the kindest eyes in the world, who shares her breakfast at the park bench near Happy Horizons Elementary. It wasn't difficult to locate you," Mrs. Winters approached cautiously. "Is everything all right?" Mr. Davidson glanced up. "We're discussing some sensitive information. Emily's friend has passed away." Mrs. Winters' hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Emily, I'm so sorry." She knelt beside the small chair. "Would you like me to call your mother?" Emily nodded, more tears flowing now. As Mrs. Winters stepped away to make the call, Mr. Davidson continued softly. "Colonel Harrington left something for you, Emily, a letter and some other items that I'll need to discuss with your mother. Emily." stared at her hands, trying to process everything. Jack was a colonel. Jack had a last name, Harrington. Jack was gone forever, not just missing. And somehow, despite his mysterious life and all the things she hadn't known about him, he had made sure to remember her. "He never said goodbye," she whispered. Mr. Davidson placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I think, in his way, that's what this letter is meant to be." Maggie arrived at the school within 20 minutes, her hair disheveled from rushing out of Mrs. Greenwood's house where she'd been cleaning. Her eyes darted worriedly between Emily's tear-stained face and the composed attorney standing beside her daughter. "Ms. Monroe," Mr. Davidson extended his hand, "I'm Thomas Davidson, Colonel Harrington's attorney. I apologize for bringing this news to Emily at school, but the colonel was quite specific about his wishes." "Colonel?" Maggie echoed unconsciously, echoing her daughter's earlier confusion as she shook his hand. "You mean Jack, the man from the park?" Mr. Davidson nodded. "Colonel Jonathan Harrington, yes. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private? I have several matters to address regarding the colonel's final requests." The principal offered her office a small room with motivational posters and children's artwork on the walls. Emily sat close to her mother on a worn couch, still trying to understand that Jack, her Jack, was gone forever. "Colonel Harrington left specific instructions," Mr. Davidson began, opening his briefcase. "First, a letter for Emily," he asked, "that she be allowed to read it privately or with her mother present, whichever she prefers." He handed over a sealed envelope. Emily's name was written on the front in neat, precise handwriting. Nothing like the scrawl she would have expected. "From a homeless man." "Together," Emily whispered, looking up at her mother. "Please." Maggie nodded, her arm tightening around Emily's shoulders as her daughter carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper filled with the same meticulous handwriting. Emily took a deep breath and began to read aloud, her young voice, stumbling occasionally over the unfamiliar words. "Dear Emily, if you're reading this, then I've finally received my last set of orders. I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye properly. In my experience, goodbyes are rarely as clean or satisfying as people hope. My name, my full name, is Colonel Jonathan Jack Harrington, USMC, retired. I commanded the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines in Afghanistan. Before that, I served in the Gulf War and in peacekeeping operations around the world. I want you to know that the half sandwiches and apples you shared with me for the past 3 years were the most important meals of my life, not because I was hungry, though sometimes I was, but because they were given with pure kindness, without judgment or pity. When I returned from my last deployment, I brought home wounds that didn't show. On the outside. The doctors call it PTSD. I call it carrying my men with me. I lost 5 Marines in an ambush. Good men. After that, I couldn't bear the weight of normal life anymore. The meaningless conversations, the petty problems, the constant noise of a world that had no idea what happened in those distant mountains. So I walked away. From my pension, my apartment, my remaining family, I chose the streets because they were quiet, and because the suffering there was honest. Then I met you. You reminded me what innocence looked like, what kindness looked like when it asked for nothing in return. Gradually, you became my mission, the reason to stay sober, to stay alert, to stay alive. Protecting you, even in that small way each morning, gave me purpose again. I've made arrangements for you through Mr. Davidson. Nothing elaborate. I don't believe in spoiling children, but enough to ensure you get the education you deserve. Your intelligence and compassion should be nurtured. I've also contacted some of my former Marines. They're good men who've been looking for me for years. I've asked them to meet you. They'll understand why when they do. Thank you for the sandwiches, Emily. Thank you for the conversations. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. Semper Fidelis, Colonel Jonathan Jack Harrington. Emily lowered the letter, tears flowing freely now. Maggie was crying too, one hand pressed against her mouth. He wasn't just homeless, Emily said quietly. He was lost. Mr. Davidson cleared his throat, his professional demeanor momentarily cracked by emotion. The colonel was a highly decorated officer. Silver Star? Bronze Star? Purple Heart. His action saved an entire company in Afghanistan. After his last tour, he suffered severe post-traumatic stress. He disappeared from the VA system about 4 years ago. His former Marines have been searching for him ever since. He mentioned arrangements, Maggie said cautiously. Mr. Davidson nodded. Educational trust. Modest but sufficient. Enough to ensure Emily can attend college someday if she chooses. Colonel Harrington lived simply, but he came from family money that he never touched. He also maintained his military benefits and pension, though he rarely accessed them. Everything accumulated. Emily wasn't listening to the financial details. She was rereading the letter, tracing her finger over the words. He says his Marines are coming to meet me. What does that mean? Mr. Davidson checked his watch. It means, Emily, that 12 United States Marines are flying in tomorrow morning. Their commanding officer asked permission to visit your classroom. They want to meet the girl who cared for their colonel when no one else could find him. That evening, Emily sat cross-legged on her bed, Jack's letter spread before her. She'd read it so many times that the creases were starting to wear thin. In the kitchen, she could hear her mother's hushed phone conversation with Mr. Davidson, discussing details Emily didn't fully understand. A trust fund? Are you sure? Maggie's voice carried through the thin walls. I can't accept this. I never even spoke to him. Emily traced her finger over Jack's signature. Colonel Jonathan Jack Harrington. The name felt foreign compared to the simple Jack she had known. She wondered what he had looked like in his uniform, with medals pinned to his chest instead of the worn olive jacket she had grown accustomed to seeing. Maggie appeared in the doorway, her expression troubled. Emily, honey, we need to talk about tomorrow. Emily looked up. About the Marines coming? Maggie nodded, sitting on the edge of the bed. Mr. Davidson says they want to visit your classroom. Captain Reynolds, he's their commanding officer. He served under Colonel Harrington in Afghanistan. Apparently, they've been searching for the colonel for years. Why didn't he want to be found? Emily asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since reading the letter. Maggie sighed, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes when people go through very difficult experiences, especially in war, they need space. Colonel Harrington was dealing with a lot of pain, the kind you can't see from the outside. His letter said he had PTSD, Emily said, pronouncing each letter carefully. Post-traumatic stress disorder, Maggie explained. It happens when someone experiences something terrible, and their mind keeps reliving it. It can make normal life very hard. Emily considered this, thinking of the days when Jack had sat rigidly on the right side of the bench, silent and distant. Had he been reliving those terrible moments then? Are you okay with the Marines visiting your class? Maggie asked. If it's too much, I can ask them to meet you somewhere else. Or we could wait a while. Emily shook her head firmly. I want to meet them. Jack, Colonel Harrington, wanted me to meet them too. It's important. Maggie brushed a strand of hair from Emily's forehead. Mr. Davidson mentioned something else. The Marines want you to participate in Colonel Harrington's memorial service. It would be at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. Emily's eyes widened. Arlington? Isn't that where they bury important soldiers? Very important ones, yes. Colonel Harrington earned that honor through his service. What would I have to do at the memorial? Emily asked, nervousness creeping into her voice. Captain Reynolds would like you to place something on the colonel's casket during the ceremony, something personal that represents your friendship. Emily thought immediately of their bench, of the countless sandwich halves and quiet conversations. What could possibly represent that bond? Mr. Davidson also mentioned. Maggie hesitated. Emily, Colonel Harrington left a substantial amount of money for your education. A trust fund that will pay for college. Emily frowned, trying to process this new information. But Jack didn't have money. He was homeless. It's complicated, sweetheart. Mr. Davidson explained that the colonel came from a wealthy family and had his military pension. He chose not to use that money while he was living on the streets. Why would he leave it to me? Emily whispered, overwhelmed. Maggie pulled her daughter close. Because you saw him, the real him, when no one else did. You treated him with dignity when others looked away. Emily leaned against her mother, tears threatening again. I miss him. I know, baby. I know. The next morning brought chaos as Emily prepared for school. What did one wear to meet 12 Marines who had come to honor their fallen commander? Emily finally settled on her nicest dress, navy blue with white polka dots, and asked her mother to braid her hair. "You look beautiful," Maggie assured her, smoothing Emily's collar. "I'm scared," Emily admitted, as they walked toward the school, slower than their usual rushed pace. "What if I say something wrong? Just be yourself," Maggie advised. That's who Colonel Harrington cared about. Mr. Davidson was waiting at the school entrance, immaculate in another perfectly tailored suit. Beside him stood a tall man with a military bearing that reminded Emily achingly of Jack. Unlike Jack, however, this man wore a crisp uniform with gleaming insignia. "Emily, this is Captain Michael Reynolds," Mr. Davidson introduced them. Captain Reynolds knelt to Emily's level, his face solemn but kind. "Miss Monroe, it's an honor to meet you. Colonel Harrington was my commanding officer, my mentor, and my friend." Emily swallowed hard. "He was my friend too." The captain nodded, understanding in his eyes. The colonel's last request was that his Marines meet the girl who brought light back into his life. "We've arranged everything with your principal and—" "Teacher, my men are waiting outside your classroom. Are you ready for this?" Emily glanced at her mother, who gave an encouraging nod, then back to Captain Reynolds. Colonel Harrington, he saved your lives, didn't he? That's what Mr. Davidson said." "More than once," Captain Reynolds confirmed, "and according to his letter to us, you saved his in a different way." Emily took a deep breath, squaring her small shoulders in an unconscious echo of Jack's military posture. "Then, I'm ready." Emily's classroom hummed with the normal morning activity. Homework being collected, pencils sharpened, quiet conversations about television shows and video games. Mrs. Winters was writing the day's schedule on the whiteboard, her back to the class. No one seemed aware that anything extraordinary was about to happen. Emily slid into her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her friend Zach leaned over. "Why are you so dressed up?" he whispered. "And why was your mom here? Before?" Emily could answer. The principal's voice came over the intercom. "Mrs. Winters, please prepare your class for special visitors." The classroom immediately erupted in whispers. Special visitors usually meant a police officer with a drug-sniffing dog, or sometimes a parent with an interesting job. Mrs. Winters clapped her hands for attention. "Class, we have some very important guests coming to speak with us today. I expect your very best behavior." Her eyes found Emily, softening with understanding. "Emily, would you like to come to the front?" 24 pairs of curious eyes followed. Emily, as she made her way to Mrs. Winters' side, the teacher placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Emily has recently lost a dear friend," Mrs. Winters explained to the class. "Our visitors today are here to honor that friend. Emily, would you like to tell the class who's coming?" Emily swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "Marines," she managed. 12 Marines who served with my friend Jack, except his real name was Colonel Harrington." Confused murmurs rippled through the classroom. Everyone knew about Emily's homeless friend. It had been the subject of playground gossip for years. Some parents had even complained about their children being so close to a street person each morning. A knock at the classroom door silenced the whispers. Mrs. Winters opened it, exchanging quiet words with someone in the hallway. She turned back to the class, her expression unusually solemn. "Class, please stand to welcome our guests." The scraping of chairs filled the room as 24 third graders stood, curiosity evident on every face. Emily remained at the front, her hands clasped tightly together to stop their trembling. And then it happened. The door opened fully and the first Marine stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in his formal blue uniform with white cap tucked precisely under his arm. His face was solemn, eyes forward. He was followed by another and another, until 12 Marines in perfect formation stood at attention along the back wall of the classroom. The air in the room changed. Even the most fidgety students stood straighter, instinctively responding to the palpable sense of ceremony and respect the Marines brought with them. Captain Reynolds entered last, positioning himself directly in front of Emily. With practiced precision, He saluted her, a gesture that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Miss Emily Monroe," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent classroom. "On behalf of the United States Marine Corps and the men of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, we are here to honor the memory of our commanding officer, Colonel Jonathan Jack Harrington, and to thank you for your service to him." A collective gasp went through the classroom. Emily heard Zach whisper loudly, "Her homeless guy was a colonel?" Mrs. Winters shushed him gently. Captain Reynolds continued, his gaze never leaving Emily's face. "Colonel Harrington led us through some of the most difficult combat situations in Afghanistan. He saved countless lives, including everyone standing before you today. He was awarded the Silver Star for valor, the Bronze Star for heroism, and the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat." The captain's voice softened slightly. After returning home, Colonel Harrington battled enemies that couldn't be fought with conventional weapons. The trauma of war affected him deeply. He chose to step away from society, including those of us who served under him. For years, we searched for him without success. Emily glanced at her classmates who were listening with rapt attention. Many, open-mouthed at the revelation that the quiet homeless man from their park was actually a decorated war hero. "What we didn't know," Captain Reynolds continued, "was that Colonel Harrington had found an unexpected ally, a young civilian who offered friendship without judgment, sustenance without condition, and, most importantly, a reason to keep fighting. His internal battles," he gestured to Emily, who felt her face flush with self-consciousness. "In his final letter to us, Colonel Harrington wrote that while he had once saved our lives in combat, it was Emily Monroe who saved his life here at our home. Every morning for 3 years, she treated him with dignity and respect when most people crossed the street to avoid him. She shared not only her food, but her conversation, her trust, and her friendship." One of the Marines at the back, the tallest of the group with a scar running along his jawline, blinked rapidly, fighting visible emotion. Colonel Harrington's last request was that his Marines meet the girl who reminded him what he had fought for, the innocence and kindness that make this country worth defending. "Miss Monroe," Captain Reynolds concluded, "we are honored to fulfill our Colonel's final order." With that, all 12 Marines saluted Emily in perfect unison, a gesture normally reserved for fellow service members or the Commander-in-Chief. Emily, overwhelmed and uncertain how to respond, did the only thing that felt right. She stood as straight as she could, just as Jack had always sat on their bench, and returned their salute with her small hand. In that moment, the barrier between her two worlds, the quiet mornings with a homeless veteran and her everyday life, as a third grader, dissolved completely. Jack and Colonel Harrington became one person in her mind, her friend who had carried hidden battles and invisible medals. After the salute, Captain Reynolds motioned for Emily to sit in a special chair that had been placed at the front of the classroom. Mrs. Winters directed the rest of the students to return to their seats, though most remained perched on the edges, unwilling to miss a moment of the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. "With your permission, Mrs. Winters," Captain Reynolds said, "I'd like to tell these young people about Colonel Harrington, the man many of you knew only as Jack." Mrs. Winters nodded. "I think that would be appropriate, Captain. The Brasimenai." Captain removed a photograph from his breast pocket and handed it to Emily. It showed a younger, clean-shaven man in desert camouflage, standing tall against a backdrop of mountains. His blue eyes, Jack's eyes, stared directly at the camera with confidence and authority. "That was taken in Afghanistan, 2011, Captain Reynolds explained. Colonel Harrington was 43 then, commanding a battalion of Marines in Helmand Province, one of the most dangerous regions of the country." Emily traced the outline of Jack's face in the photograph. Without the beard and weathered lines, she might not have recognized him. Yet the eyes were unmistakable, the same ones that had watched over her every morning. Jonathan Harrington was born in Boston to a family with a long tradition of military service, Captain Reynolds began, addressing the class. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1990, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. By the time I met him in 2009, he was a lieutenant colonel with multiple combat tours behind him. The captain paced slowly at the front of the classroom, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. In Afghanistan, we faced an enemy that hid among civilians, planted explosive devices on roadsides, and attacked from the shadows. Colonel Harrington led from the front, never asking his Marines to take risks he wouldn't take himself. We called him the Old Man, a term of respect in the Corps, even though he was only in his 40s. One of the Marines, a younger man with a neatly trimmed mustache, stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant James Miller, ma'am," he introduced himself to Mrs. Winters before turning to the class. "I was a 19-year-old private on my first deployment when I met Colonel Harrington. 2 weeks in, our patrol was ambushed. I was separated from my squad, wounded, and trapped under fire." The classroom was utterly silent as Staff Sergeant Miller continued. "The colonel personally led the rescue mission. Under heavy enemy fire, he carried me over 200 meters to safety. That's nearly 2 football fields while people were shooting at him. I'm alive today because of Colonel Harrington's courage." Several students exchanged wide-eyed glances. The homeless man who fed squirrels in their park had carried wounded soldiers through gunfire. Captain Reynolds nodded gravely. That action earned Colonel Harrington his Silver Star, but the mission that defined his career and changed his life came 3 months later. The captain's voice dropped slightly, taking on a more somber tone. "Our company was conducting a routine patrol when we were hit from 3 sides. Well-planned ambush. We were pinned down in a valley with no air support available due to weather conditions. Colonel Harrington ordered the company to fall back to a defensible position while he and a small team created a diversion." Another Marine stepped forward, the tall one with the scar that Emily had noticed earlier. "Gunnery Sergeant David Ortiz," he introduced himself. "I was part of the colonel's diversion team. He led us in a flanking maneuver that drew enemy fire. Away from the main company, we engaged multiple enemy positions, giving our brothers time to reach safety. The colonel was everywhere that day, directing fire, dragging wounded Marines to cover, calling in coordinates over the radio," Captain Reynolds continued. "The diversion worked. The main company reached safety with minimal casualties. But Colonel Harrington's team paid a heavy price. 5 Marines were killed. The colonel himself was wounded while shielding a fallen Marine from additional gunfire." Emily stared at the photograph in her hands, trying to reconcile the heroic commander from these stories with the quiet man who had sat beside her on a park bench for 3 years. "The physical wounds healed," Captain Reynolds said quietly. The others didn't. Colonel Harrington completed his tour and returned home with a Purple Heart and Bronze Star to add to his decorations. But he wasn't the same man. The loss of those 5 Marines, his Marines, weighed on him heavily. The captain looked directly at Emily. In his final letter to us, Colonel Harrington wrote that he carried those 5 men with him every day. The weight of those losses, combined with the accumulated trauma of multiple combat tours, led to severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Mrs. Winters raised her hand gently. "Captain, could you explain PTSD in terms our students might understand?" Captain Reynolds nodded. "Imagine experiencing the most frightening day of your life, but then your mind keeps bringing you back to that day over and over. Loud noises might sound like explosions. Crowds might feel dangerous. Sleep brings nightmares." The colonel described it as being trapped in combat long after leaving the battlefield. A girl in the back row raised her hand tentatively. "Is that why he became homeless?" "The colonel wasn't technically homeless," Captain Reynolds clarified. "He had financial resources and was entitled to VA benefits and his military pension. He chose to live simply on the streets, away from the noise and complications of everyday life." In his letter, he explained that he found a kind of peace in that simplicity. He looked again at Emily. "And then he found an unexpected source of hope, a little girl who didn't see a homeless veteran or a decorated Marine Corps officer. She just saw Jack, a human being worthy of kindness and friendship." After Captain Reynolds finished speaking, he invited his Marines to share their personal memories of Colonel Harrington. Emily sat transfixed as one by one, these imposing men in their dress uniforms stepped forward to reveal glimpses of Jack. She had never known. Sergeant Thomas Reeves, said a Marine with close-cropped red hair and freckles across his nose. The colonel had this habit of carrying hard candies in his pocket, peppermints usually. If you'd had a particularly rough day or completed a difficult mission, he'd walk by, clap you on the shoulder, and somehow a peppermint would appear in your hand. Never made a big deal of it, just his way of saying good job without words. Emily's hand instinctively went to her pocket where she had kept a peppermint Jack had given her on her 6th birthday. She had saved it, never unwrapping it as a special treasure. She hadn't known it was part of a larger pattern. Another Marine stepped forward, shorter than the others but with the build of a weightlifter. Corporal William Chen. The colonel knew all our family details, wives' names, kids' birthdays, where everyone was from. He'd remember to ask how your mom's surgery went, or if your brother got into that college he wanted. Made us feel like more than just Marines, like we mattered as people. Emily nodded, remembering how Jack had always asked about her mother's different jobs, remembering details about each one that even Emily sometimes forgot. Lieutenant Marcus Jackson introduced a tall black Marine with kind eyes. When my daughter was born during our deployment, the colonel arranged for satellite communication so I could see her. Military regulations didn't technically allow it, but he pulled strings, said some moments were too important to miss, war or no war. One by one, the Marines shared their stories, some humorous, others deeply moving. They spoke of Colonel Harrington's tactical brilliance in the field, his unwavering calm under fire, his fierce protection of his men, and the small human gestures that had earned their enduring loyalty. We looked for him for years after he disappeared, Staff Sergeant Miller explained, directing his words to Emily. At first, through official channels, VA hospitals, military contacts. When those led nowhere, we tried homeless shelters, veterans outreach programs. Several of us took leaves of absence to search cities where there had been possible sightings. The colonel didn't want to be found, added Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz. He was an intelligence officer before taking command of our battalion. He knew how to disappear. Captain Reynolds rejoined the conversation. We never stopped looking. Every year we would pool resources and choose new cities to search. We established a network of contacts in veteran services across the country. Last year we came close. A VA hospital in Philadelphia had treated a man matching his description, but he left before we could verify his identity. Why didn't he want you to find him? Emily asked, the question that had been burning inside her since reading Jack's letter. The Marines exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Captain Reynolds answered. The colonel's letter explained that he couldn't reconcile the man his Marines thought he was with the man he believed himself to be after losing those 5 men. He wrote that he didn't deserve our respect or loyalty after failing to bring everyone home. But that's not true, protested Corporal Chen. He saved dozens of lives that day. The ambush wasn't his fault. Captain Reynolds nodded. We know that, but trauma doesn't always allow for rational thinking. The colonel carried a burden of survivor's guilt that ultimately led him to separate himself from everyone who knew him, family, friends, and his Marines. Everyone except Emily, Lieutenant Jackson said softly. All eyes turned to her, and Emily felt her face flush. I didn't know who he was, she said simply. I just knew he looked sad and hungry. And that, Captain Reynolds said, is exactly why you reached him when no one else could. You had no expectations based on his past. You accepted him exactly as he appeared each day. A thoughtful silence fell over the classroom, broken only when a boy near the back cautiously raised his hand. Yes, Tyler, Mrs. Winters acknowledged. If he was such a great soldier, why didn't he get help? My uncle has PTSD from Iraq, and he goes to therapy at the VA hospital. Captain Reynolds nodded appreciatively at the question. That's an excellent point. Many veterans do seek and receive effective treatment for PTSD. Colonel Harrington initially participated in treatment programs, but eventually withdrew. His generation of military leaders was taught that showing any psychological vulnerability was weakness. That mindset can make it especially difficult to accept help. Mrs. Winters glanced at the clock, clearly torn between the educational value of this extraordinary visit and her responsibility to the day's curriculum. Captain Reynolds noticed. "We've taken enough of your class time," he said. "But before we go, we have a request for Emily, if she's willing." Emily sat up straighter. "What is it?" "Colonel Harrington will receive full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery next week. We'd like you and your mother to attend as our guests. The colonel specifically requested your presence in his final instructions." Emily looked questioningly at her mother, who had been standing quietly at the back of the classroom throughout the Marine's visit. Maggie nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'd like that," Emily said. Colonel Harrington, he deserves to be honored properly." Captain Reynolds smiled, the first real smile Emily had seen from him. "He does indeed. And so do you, Emily Monroe." The colonel's last letter to us made one thing very clear. When he had lost faith in humanity and himself, you restored it, one half sandwich at a time. After the Marines departed, Emily's classroom buzzed with excited discussion. Mrs. Winters wisely abandoned her lesson plan for a group conversation about veterans, service, and the hidden struggles many face after returning from war. Emily, however, remained quiet, processing everything she had learned about the man she had known simply as Jack. At lunchtime, she sat with her mother in the school cafeteria, pushing food around her plate without much appetite. "You okay, sweetheart?" Maggie asked, reaching across to tuck a strand of hair behind Emily's ear. "I just don't understand," Emily said finally. "If Jack, Colonel Harrington, had money and a pension, why did he live on the streets? Why did he let people think he was just a homeless man?" Mr. Davidson, who had remained at the school throughout the Marine's visit, approached their table. "With Captain Reynolds, may we join you?" the attorney asked. At Maggie's nod, both men sat down. Emily was just asking why the colonel chose homelessness when he had resources, Maggie explained. Captain Reynolds considered his answer carefully. "Colonel Harrington's letter to us explained some of his reasoning. May I share that with Emily?" Maggie nodded, and Emily looked up expectantly. The colonel wrote that after his medical discharge, he tried to return to normal civilian life. He had an apartment in Washington, D.C., received treatment at the VA, and even consulted for a defense contractor for a while. But he described feeling like he was wearing a costume, pretending to be a functional civilian while inside he was still at war. The captain's eyes grew distant, as if seeing something beyond the cafeteria walls. He wrote about the constant noise of the city aggravating his hypervigilance. That's when your body stays on high alert for danger. Traffic sounds like explosions. Crowds feel threatening. Sleep becomes almost impossible. So he left to find. "Quiet?" Emily asked. "Partly," Captain Reynolds confirmed. He wrote that one night, after weeks without proper sleep, he simply walked out of his apartment with only what he could carry. He found an isolated spot in a park and slept better than he had in months. That began his alternative lifestyle. Mr. Davidson added, "The colonel maintained a small safety deposit box at a bank where he kept his identification, military records, and contact information for me as his attorney. Periodically, he would access his accounts, withdraw minimal cash, then return to living on the streets. He chose this existence deliberately." "But why?" Emily persisted, struggling to understand. Captain Reynolds sighed. The colonel carried tremendous guilt over the Marines lost under his command. In his mind, living comfortably while they were gone felt wrong. He wrote that the deprivations of street life were a form of penance, a way of honoring their sacrifice. By sacrificing his own comfort, Emily frowned, remembering Jack's stoicism during freezing winters and sweltering summers. There was another reason, Captain Reynolds continued more gently. He wrote that conventional therapy hadn't helped him, but in the homeless community, he found others, many of them veterans, who understood his experiences without judgment. There was an honesty in their struggles that he found more healing than formal treatment programs. "And then he found you," Mr. Davidson said, looking at Emily. In his instructions to me, he wrote that watching your uncomplicated kindness restored something he thought he'd lost forever, faith in human goodness. Maggie wiped a tear from her cheek. I wish I had known. I could have helped somehow. The Colonel was clear that he didn't want help in the conventional sense, Mr. Davidson assured her. What Emily provided was exactly what he needed, simple human connection without the complications of his past identity or trauma. Captain Reynolds pulled a small notebook from his pocket. Emily, there's something else you should know. For the past 2 years, the Colonel was working on his memoirs. We found the manuscript among his few possessions at the hospital. Emily's eyes widened. He was writing a book? Not exactly for publication, the captain clarified. More as a record for his family and his Marines. But you feature prominently in the later chapters. He opened the notebook to a marked page and read, "The child's constancy became my anchor. In a life where I had deliberately eliminated routine and certainty, her regular appearance each morning, rain or shine, warm or cold, became the fixed point around which my days revolved. Her innocence reminded me daily of what we had fought to protect. In time, protecting her, watching over her until she safely entered the school building, scanning for potential threats in the park, became my new mission." Emily smiled through tears. She had always felt Jack's protective presence, but hadn't realized how purposeful it had been. "There's more," Captain Reynolds continued. "I never told Emily of my past. In her eyes, I was simply Jack, not Colonel Harrington with his failures and losses. Her unconditional acceptance healed parts of me that doctors and therapists couldn't reach. She had no agenda beyond basic human kindness, and in that simplicity lay a profound medicine." Mr. Davidson cleared his throat. "The Colonel's will has specific provisions for Emily. Beyond the educational trust, he left instructions for certain personal items to be given to her, including his medals and the flag that will drape his casket at Arlington." "I can't take those things," Emily protested. "They should go to his family." Captain Reynolds shook his head. "The Colonel had no immediate family left. His parents are deceased, and he never married. His Marines were his family, and you, Emily, you became the daughter he never had." Emily looked down at her barely touched lunch, overwhelmed by the responsibility of carrying Jack's legacy. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "I just shared my breakfast." "Sometimes," Captain Reynolds said softly, "the smallest acts of kindness have the greatest impact. The Colonel faced enemies in combat and survived, but it was the battle inside himself that nearly destroyed him, until a little girl with half a sandwich showed him that life still contained goodness worth living for." The days leading up to the Arlington ceremony passed in a blur for Emily. School suddenly seemed trivial compared to the weight of honoring Jack's memory. Her classmates treated her differently now, with a mixture of awe and curiosity that made her uncomfortable. She missed the simplicity of her mornings with Jack, where no words were needed and expectations were clear. Preparations for the trip to Arlington consumed the Monroe household. Maggie fretted over appropriate clothing, finally purchasing a simple black dress for Emily at a consignment shop. Their budget stretched thin, despite Mr. Davidson's assurance that all travel expenses would be covered by Colonel Harrington's estate. "Mom," Emily asked the night before their flight, as Maggie ironed their best clothes, "did you ever talk to Jack, even once?" Maggie paused, the iron hovering above the fabric. "Once, last winter, during that big snowstorm, I was worried about you sitting out in that weather, so I walked you all the way to the bench instead of watching from the corner like usual." Emily waited, surprised by this revelation. "He stood up when he saw me approaching with you," Maggie continued. "Very formal, like he was meeting someone important. I introduced myself, and he nodded, didn't speak at first. I told him I appreciated him looking out for you. That's when he said, 'Your daughter has a rare gift, ma'am. She sees people others don't.'" Maggie's eyes grew distant with the memory. Something about the way he said it, his posture, his eyes, I could tell he wasn't just some random homeless person. There was dignity there, intelligence. After that, I worried less about your mornings with him." Emily nodded, pleased to have this new piece of the puzzle that was Jack's life. The next morning brought their first ever plane ride. Emily's face pressed against the window as they soared above clouds, her earlier sadness temporarily eclipsed by the wonder of flight. Captain Reynolds met them at Reagan National Airport, along with Lieutenant Jackson, both in their dress blue uniforms. "The colonel's service will be tomorrow morning," Captain Reynolds explained, as they drove toward the hotel where arrangements had been made for Emily and her mother. "Today we thought you might want to see some of the monuments in D.C., if you're not too tired from your journey." Emily had never been outside her small town before. The Capitol's grand buildings and monuments left her wide-eyed with awe. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, she watched Captain Reynolds and Lieutenant Jackson render solemn salutes, understanding better now the brotherhood that had bound Jack to his Marines. That evening, back at the hotel, a package was delivered. To the room, a small box with Emily's name carefully printed on the label. Inside was a note from Mr. Davidson explaining that Colonel Harrington had requested she wear the enclosed item for the ceremony. Nestled in tissue paper lay a simple silver bracelet. Emily lifted it carefully, noticing names engraved on the metal. "Band. It's a memorial bracelet," Captain Reynolds explained when he came to check on their preparations. "Those are the names of the 5 Marines lost during the ambush, the men the colonel carried with him always. He wore this every day, even on the streets." Emily slipped it onto her wrist, the metal cool against her skin. The bracelet was much too large, sliding almost to her elbow. "We can adjust it," Captain Reynolds offered. "No," Emily said firmly. "I want to wear it just as he did." The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cool. Emily stood before the hotel mirror in her black dress, the oversized memorial bracelet secured in place with a safety pin to keep it from sliding off. Her mother had braided her hair neatly, threading a black ribbon through the plait. "You look very grown up," Maggie said softly, her own eyes red from a night of little sleep. A government car delivered them to Arlington National Cemetery, where they were escorted to a section reserved for military funerals. Emily had never seen anything like it. The perfectly aligned white headstones stretching across gentle hills in every direction, each representing a life given in service. Captain Reynolds met them at the administration building, accompanied by the other Marines who had visited Emily's classroom, all in their dress blue uniforms with white gloves and medals displayed. "Emily," Captain Reynolds said, kneeling to her level, "I need to explain your role in the ceremony." The colonel requested something specific. He handed her a white napkin, neatly folded into a square. Emily recognized it immediately as one of the cafeteria napkins she had wrapped countless sandwich halves in over the years. "We found this in the colonel's personal effects," Captain Reynolds explained. "Your mother confirmed it matches the ones from your school cafeteria. Apparently, he kept every napkin you used to wrap his food." Emily stared at the simple square of paper, imagining Jack carefully preserving these humble items that most people would discard without thought. "During the ceremony after the rifle salute, you'll be invited to place this on the colonel's casket before the flag is folded. It's unconventional, but the colonel was specific. He wrote that it represented the purest act of kindness he had received since returning from war." Emily nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She folded the napkin carefully and placed it in her dress pocket. "There will be more people than just us," Captain Reynolds continued. "Word spread through the Marine Corps community about the colonel's story, your story together. Several high-ranking officers are attending, along with veterans who served with the colonel in earlier deployments." As if to confirm his words, 3 sleek black cars pulled up, disgorging somber men in suits and uniforms. Emily recognized the insignia of generals on some of the uniforms. "Are you ready?" Captain Reynolds asked gently. Emily touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, drawing strength from the names engraved there, the men Jack had carried with him all these years. She straightened her shoulders in unconscious imitation of his military. "Bearing. I'm ready," she said, her young voice steady despite the tears threatening behind her eyes. Emily had seen military funerals in movies, but nothing had prepared her for the solemn reality of Arlington. The crisp spring air carried the scent of freshly cut grass as they walked toward the ceremony site. A horse-drawn caisson bearing Jack's flag-draped casket proceeded slowly along the paved road, accompanied by a Marine Corps band playing a somber march. Captain Reynolds guided Emily and Maggie to seats in the front row, positioned under a small canopy near the gravesite. Emily was startled by the number of people in attendance. At least 100 uniformed service members and civilians stood in respectful silence as the caisson approached. "All these people knew Jack?" she whispered to Captain Reynolds. "Many served with him throughout his career," he replied quietly. "Others came because they heard his story, and yours. The Brotherhood of Marines extends beyond death. The Seven Poor." Horses pulling the caisson, 6 saddled, 1 riderless to symbolize a fallen warrior, came to a halt near the gravesite. 6 Marines in immaculate dress blues approached the caisson, moving with synchronized precision to lift the casket and carry it to the burial site. Emily's eyes fixed on the flag draped over the casket, the same flag that would eventually be presented to her according to Jack's wishes. The reality of his death struck her anew as the casket was positioned over the open grave. A chaplain stepped forward, opening a prayer book, his words about service, sacrifice, and eternal rest washed over Emily, who found herself remembering not Colonel Harrington, the war hero, but Jack, the quiet man who accepted her childish chatter with patient dignity, who watched protectively as she entered school each day, whose rare smiles felt like precious gifts. After the prayer, a Marine general whom Emily didn't recognize delivered a eulogy highlighting Colonel Harrington's distinguished service record, his leadership qualities, and the lives he had saved. It was formally appropriate, but somehow missed the essence of the man Emily had known. Then, unexpectedly, Captain Reynolds was called forward. He stood at attention beside the casket, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery grounds. "Colonel, Harrington's official record speaks for itself," he began, "but the measure of this man extends far beyond his decorations or battlefield courage. After war damaged his spirit when he chose to walk away from society's comforts, he maintained his core values of duty and honor." The captain's voice softened slightly. In his final instructions, the colonel requested that I share how a child's kindness became his salvation. For 3 years, a 7-year-old girl named Emily Monroe, he gestured toward Emily, shared her breakfast with a man she knew only as Jack. She didn't know he was a decorated Marine Corps officer. She simply saw a human being in need of friendship. Emily felt all eyes turned toward her, and she fixed her gaze on her hands folded in her lap, the oversized memorial bracelet gleaming on her wrist. In the colonel's own words, Captain Reynolds continued, "This child accomplished what trained therapists, medication, and the VA system could not. She restored my faith in the goodness we fight to defend. She reminded me daily that innocence and compassion still exist in this world. Without knowing it, she gave me a mission when I had lost my purpose, to be worthy of her kindness, to protect her in my small way, to demonstrate that her trust was not misplaced." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Several of the Marines from Jack's former unit stood straighter, blinking rapidly against apparent emotion. The colonel's last request, Captain Reynolds concluded, was that we honor not only his military service, but also this unlikely friendship that sustained him in his darkest hours. With that, 7 Marines positioned themselves at a distance, rifles at the ready. Emily jumped at the first sharp crack of the rifle salute, her mother's arm tightening around her shoulders. The 3 volleys, 21 shots in all, echoed across Arlington's hallowed grounds. As the last echo faded, a lone bugler began playing taps. The hauntingly beautiful melody brought tears to Emily's eyes, and she no longer tried to hold them back. This was goodbye, the farewell she had never been able to give Jack when he disappeared from the park bench. When the final note faded, Captain Reynolds approached Emily. "It's time," he said gently. On legs that suddenly felt unsteady, Emily rose and walked toward the casket. The Marines who would fold the flag stood at attention, waiting. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the cafeteria napkin, such a small, ordinary thing to represent a friendship that had saved a man's life. With trembling fingers, she placed it on the center of the flag-draped casket. The simple white square stood out starkly against the vibrant red, white, and blue. A breeze lifted one corner of the napkin, and Emily quickly smoothed it down, her hand lingering for a moment on the flag that covered Jack's final resting place. "Goodbye, Jack," she whispered, too quietly for anyone else to hear. She stepped back, returning to her mother's side as the Marines began the precise, ceremonial folding of the flag. 12 folds later, the flag had been transformed into a tight triangle with only the blue field and white stars visible. The Marine who held it performed a precise about-face and marched toward Emily. Captain Reynolds had explained this part of the ceremony to her earlier, how the flag would normally be presented to next of kin with the words, "On behalf of the President of the United States Marine Corps, and a grateful nation," the Marine knelt before Emily, holding the folded flag with white-gloved hands. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice formal but kind, "on behalf of the President of the United States Marine Corps, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for Colonel Harrington's honorable and faithful service, and for your own service to him." With solemn dignity, he extended the flag to Emily, who accepted it with both hands, cradling it against her chest, as she had been instructed. The weight of it surprised her, not just physically, but the emotional weight of all that it represented. After the ceremony, a reception was held at the Officers' Club, an elegant building that made Emily feel self-conscious in her second-hand dress. Still clutching the folded flag, she stayed close to her mother as uniformed officers and civilians approached to offer condolences and, more surprisingly, thanks. "Your kindness to the colonel meant more than you can know," said a silver-haired man who introduced himself as a former commanding officer from Jack's early career. "He was a fine Marine and a better man." Emily nodded, unsure how to respond to such comments. These people had known a version of Jack she had never met, the confident leader, the tactical genius, the decorated officer. Her Jack had been quiet, watchful, and wounded. Both versions were real, she realized, parts of a complex whole she was only beginning to understand. As the reception wound down, Mr. Davidson approached with a leather portfolio under his arm. "Emily, Ms. Monroe, if you have a moment, there are some matters we need to discuss before you return home tomorrow." He led them to a small private room adjacent to the main reception area. Captain Reynolds joined them, along with a woman in a Navy uniform whom Mr. Davidson introduced as Commander Wilson from the Judge Advocate General's office. "Standard procedure for execution of military wills," he explained, noting their questioning looks at the commander's presence. They sat around a polished oak table, the flag resting in Emily's lap. Mr. Davidson opened his portfolio and removed several documents. "As I mentioned previously, Colonel Harrington established an educational trust for Emily," he began. "I'd like to explain the details of that arrangement now." Maggie shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Davidson, while we appreciate the Colonel's generosity, we can't accept—" "Ms. Monroe," he interrupted gently, "the Colonel anticipated your reluctance. He included a personal note addressing this very concern." He handed Maggie a sealed envelope with her name written on it. While Maggie read the note, her expression softening, Mr. Davidson continued speaking to Emily. "The Colonel's educational trust will cover your full college expenses at any institution you choose, including graduate school if you decide to pursue advanced degrees. Additionally, there's a stipend for books, living expenses, and educational travel." Emily's eyes widened. College had always been a distant dream, something her mother mentioned as a goal, but never discussed in concrete terms due to their financial limitations. "Beyond education," Mr. Davidson continued, "the Colonel left specific personal items for you." Captain Reynolds placed a polished wooden box on the table and opened it to reveal several military medals nestled in velvet. "These are the Colonel's decorations," he explained, pointing to each one. "The Silver Star, for gallantry in action. The Bronze Star, with combat, V for valor. 3 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. These medals are usually displayed by the family or passed down to children." Emily stared at the gleaming medals, remembering Jack in his tattered olive jacket on the park bench, no visible sign of the hero these decorations represented. "There's something else," Commander Wilson said, speaking for the first time. She produced a small velvet bag and handed it to Emily. "These were the Colonel's dog tags. He specifically requested you have them." Emily carefully emptied the bag into her palm. 2 metal tags on a chain slid out, the stamped information still clearly legible. Harrington, Jonathan A., USMC. OPOS, Christian. She closed her fingers around the tags, feeling the cool metal warm against her skin. Maggie finished, reading her letter, wiping away tears. "He thought of everything," she said quietly. "What did his letter say?" Emily asked. "He knew I'd be uncomfortable accepting such a large gift," Maggie explained. "He wrote that he had no family to leave his assets to, and that helping you get an education would give meaning to his wealth in a way nothing else could. He said," her voice broke slightly, "he said that watching me work multiple jobs to provide for you reminded him of his own mother, who did the same after his father died, and that he would consider it an honor to lighten that burden." Emily slipped the dog tags around her neck, the medal disappearing beneath her dress collar. Mr. Davidson cleared his throat. "There's one more item." The Colonel maintained a safety deposit box at Capital Federal Bank. Among the contents was this. He removed a small box from his portfolio. Inside was a key attached to a simple keychain with a single word engraved on a silver disc: Hope. "This is the key to a storage unit in your hometown," Mr. Davidson explained. "The Colonel rented it 5 years ago, before he arrived in your community. According to his notes, it contains personal journals, photographs, and mementos from his military career that he couldn't carry with him but couldn't bring himself to discard." "He knew where he was going?" Emily asked, surprised. "He planned to come to our town?" Captain Reynolds and Mr. Davidson exchanged glances. "Not exactly," the captain said carefully. "Based on his notes and what we've pieced together, the Colonel rented storage units in several cities across the country. He would travel from place to place, staying until he needed to move on." "Why did he stay in our town for so long?" Maggie asked. Captain Reynolds smiled gently at Emily. "I think you know the answer to that, Ms. Monroe." Emily clutched the key, understanding dawning. Jack had found something in their small town that had anchored him. Their morning ritual, her consistent presence, the simplicity of their bench by the school. "There's one final provision in the Colonel's will," Mr. Davidson said, "though it's more of a request than a legal obligation. He asked that you consider allowing his Marines to establish a scholarship in his name at your school for children of veterans or those who have demonstrated exceptional kindness to others." "The Jack Harrington Memorial Scholarship," Captain Reynolds suggested. "We've already received commitments from many of his former Marines to contribute." Emily nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Her mother answered for her. "I think that would be a wonderful tribute," Maggie said, "both to the Colonel and to the power of simple kindness." Emily and her mother returned home the day after the Arlington ceremony, their small apartment feeling different somehow, as if the experience had altered their perception of the space they'd always known. Emily placed the folded flag on her dresser, propping Jack's medals beside it. The dog tags remained around her neck, tucked beneath her clothing like a secret talisman. School had changed, too. Her classmates treated her with a mixture of curiosity and respect after the Marine's visit. Teachers who had once frowned at her friendship with the homeless man now spoke of it as an inspiring example of compassion. Emily found the sudden attention uncomfortable, preferring the quiet simplicity of her mornings with Jack to this public recognition. 3 days after their return, a knock came at their apartment door. Maggie opened it to find Captain Reynolds and Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz standing in the hallway, both in civilian clothes but still unmistakably military in their bearing. "We've brought the Colonel's personal effects," Captain Reynolds explained, gesturing to a wooden crate between them, as specified in his will. They carried the crate into the apartment's small living room. It wasn't large, perhaps 3 feet square, but Emily approached it with reverence, as if it contained priceless treasures. "This is everything from his storage unit?" Maggie asked. "Everything except his uniforms, which he requested be donated to the Marine Corps Museum," Captain Reynolds confirmed. "We've taken the liberty of organizing the contents somewhat." The Colonel's filing system was military precise. With the adults watching, Emily carefully lifted the crate's lid. Inside were several neatly labeled folders, a leather-bound journal, and a smaller wooden box. The folders contained the Colonel's service records, copies of his commendations, and personal correspondence, Captain Reynolds explained. "The journal is his memoir, the one I mentioned previously, and the box," he hesitated. "The box contains letters from families of Marines who served under him, particularly those who didn't return." Emily lifted the small wooden box first, feeling its weight, physical and emotional. The lid was hinged, opening to reveal dozens of carefully preserved letters, each in its original envelope. She selected one at random, her eyes widening at the return address, Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, Tulsa, Oklahoma. "May I?" she asked, looking up at Captain Reynolds. He nodded. "The Colonel preserved these letters for a reason. I believe he would want you to understand this part of his story." With careful fingers, Emily unfolded the letter, dated 8 years earlier. "Dear Colonel Harrington," it began in flowing handwriting. 1 year ago today, you knocked on my door in your dress blues to tell me my son wouldn't be coming home from Afghanistan. I hated you in that moment, not for bringing the news, but for being alive when Michael wasn't. I owe you an apology for the things I said that day. Michael's squad mates have visited since then. They told me how you carried my son through gunfire, how you refused to leave him behind, even when it meant risking your own life, how you held his hand and prayed with him until the medevac arrived. They told me his last words were about me, that he asked you to tell me he wasn't afraid. You kept that promise when you came to my door, though I was too consumed by grief to recognize it then. Michael's letters home were full of admiration for you. "Womal, Mom," he wrote, "our CO is the real deal, the kind who leads from the front and would never ask us to take risks he wouldn't take himself. I will always grieve my son, but I no longer blame you for surviving when he didn't. Michael would be ashamed of me for that. If you are reading this, know that you have my deepest gratitude for being the kind of leader my son respected and for honoring his sacrifice with your continued service. With respect and gratitude, Sarah Jenkins," Michael's mom. Emily carefully refolded the letter, a lump in her throat. "He kept them all," she whispered, looking at the dozens of envelopes in the box. "Every single one," Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz confirmed. "Even the angry ones from families who needed someone to blame. The Colonel said they had earned the right to their anger." Emily selected another letter, then another. Some were brief notes of gratitude. Others were pages long, detailing the lives and dreams of fallen Marines. Many included photographs, young men in uniform, in casual settings, with friends, at family gatherings. Lives captured in images before being cut short by war. One letter in particular caught her attention, not for its content, but for its worn condition. The envelope was frayed at the edges, the letter inside creased from repeated reading. "That's from Private First Class Rodriguez's mother," Captain Reynolds said quietly, noticing which letter she had selected. He was one of the 5 lost in the ambush. The Colonel carried that letter with him everywhere, even on the streets. We found it in his coat pocket when he was taken to the hospital. Emily read it silently, tears welling in her eyes. Unlike many of the others, this letter contained no absolution, no forgiveness, only a mother's raw grief and anger at the man she held responsible for her son's death. The words were harsh, accusatory, heartbreaking in their pain. "Why would he keep this one?" Emily asked, carefully returning it to its envelope. "Why read it over and over? Captain Reynolds considered his answer carefully. The colonel believed in bearing witness to the true cost of war, not just in military casualties, but in the ripple effects through families and communities. He felt he owed it to his fallen Marines to face their families' grief, whatever form it took. He carried their memories, Emily said, echoing Jack's letter to her, and their family's pain. Yes, Captain Reynolds said simply. Emily continued exploring the box's contents, finding more letters, photographs, and small mementos. A poker chip that had been a unit good luck charm, a battered compass that had guided them through a sandstorm, a small stone from an Afghan mountaintop where they had fought together. Finally, she turned to the leather journal. Unlike the military precision of the folders and letterbox, the journal was personal, intimate, filled with Jack's meticulous handwriting, occasional sketches, and newspaper clippings. The early entries described combat operations in clinical detail, but as Emily carefully turned the pages, she noticed a shift toward more philosophical reflections on war, leadership, loss, and eventually his decision to leave conventional society. And then, near the end, she found her own name. "Today I met a child," the entry began. She offered half her sandwich without preamble or judgment. Emily, she said her name was. Just Emily, with clear eyes that looked at me, truly at me, not through me as most do. For the first time in months, I felt visible, human, not a ghost drifting between worlds. A week after receiving Jack's personal effects, Emily returned to school with a new sense of purpose. She had spent hours reading his journal entries, particularly those that mentioned her. The Jack she had known, quiet, watchful, reserved, had observed and appreciated far more than she had realized. His detailed descriptions of their conversations, her growing confidence, even the changing style of her hair ribbons, revealed how significant their simple interactions had been to him. During morning announcements, Principal Garcia's voice crackled over the intercom. "Students and faculty, please remember that our Veterans Appreciation Project launches today. Mrs. Winter's class will be leading this initiative, inspired by the remarkable story of Colonel Harrington." Emily sank lower in her seat as curious glances turned her way. The last thing she wanted was more attention. Jack, Colonel Harrington, had valued his privacy. Making his story into a school project felt wrong somehow. Mrs. Winters must have sensed Emily's discomfort. After the announcement, she called Emily to her desk while the other students began their morning work. "Emily," she said gently, "I know this might feel overwhelming. I should have discussed the project with you before announcing it." Emily nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "If you're uncomfortable with this, we can find another focus for our service project," Mrs. Winters offered. "The goal is to honor veterans and teach the class about service, but we don't have to use Colonel Harrington's story specifically." Emily considered this. Jack had been intensely private in life, but his final actions, the letter, the Marines, visiting her classroom, the memorial service, suggested he'd wanted his story told, at least in part. "What exactly is the project?" she asked cautiously. Mrs. Winters smiled. "I was thinking we could create care packages for veterans at the local VA hospital. The class would learn about military service, the challenges veterans face, and how simple acts of kindness can make a difference, just like yours did for Colonel Harrington." Put that way, it sounded like something Jack might approve of. Emily nodded slowly. "I think that would be okay. But can I help decide what goes into the packages?" "Absolutely," Mrs. Winters agreed. "In fact, I'd like you to help lead the project if you're willing." That afternoon, Emily stood nervously before her classmates, Jack's journal entry about homelessness among veterans fresh in her mind. "When Colonel Harrington, lived on our park bench, he told me once that many homeless people are veterans," she began hesitantly. "He said people thank them for their service, but don't see what that service costs them." The classroom was silent, every student focused intently on Emily, something that would have terrified her just weeks ago, but now felt important, necessary. In his journal, she continued, gaining confidence, he wrote about things that were hard for him, Loud noises, crowds, remembering to eat regular meals. He said simple comforts meant a lot when you're used to having nothing. Mrs. Winters smiled encouragingly. What kinds of things do you think should go in our care packages? Based on what Colonel Harrington shared with you? Emily considered carefully. Warm socks. Jack always said dry feet mattered more than almost anything else in the streets. Peppermints. He gave them to his Marines when they did a good job, and he gave me one on my birthday once. Maybe hand. Sanitizer, and definitely handwritten notes. Jack kept every letter anyone ever sent him. Her classmates began offering suggestions too: granola bars, pocket-sized tissues, rain ponchos, gift cards for coffee shops. Mrs. Winters listed everything on the whiteboard. Jack wrote in his journal that veterans sometimes feel forgotten. Emily added, maybe we could include our school pictures so they know real people care about them. The project quickly took shape over the following days. Parents donated items, local businesses contributed gift cards, and the art teacher helped students create personalized thank you cards. Emily found herself at the center of it all, organizing supplies and sharing carefully chosen insights from Jack's journal when relevant. Zach, who had once made fun of Emily for befriending the homeless guy, now worked alongside her with unexpected dedication. My uncle was in the Army, he confided, as they packed items into decorated shoeboxes. He doesn't talk about it much, but my mom says he has bad dreams sometimes. Emily nodded understanding. Jack had those too. He told me once that's why he didn't like to sleep in shelters. He was afraid he'd shout in his sleep and scare people. The vulnerability in sharing this piece of Jack's life, something she would never have revealed when he was alive, felt both strange and right. His story was helping others understand veterans' struggles in ways Emily hadn't anticipated. When Captain Reynolds called to check in, as he did weekly since the memorial, Emily excitedly told him about the project. The colonel would be proud, he assured her. Using his experience to help others was exactly what he would have wanted. We're delivering the care packages next week, Emily explained. 37 boxes, one for each veteran currently at the VA hospital. Mrs. Winters arranged a field trip. Would you like some Marines to accompany your class? Captain Reynolds offered. Several of us are stationed within driving distance. We'd be honored to participate. The day of the VA hospital visit arrived with perfect spring weather. 3. Marines in dress uniforms, Captain Reynolds, Lieutenant Jackson, and Sergeant Reeves, met Emily's class at the hospital entrance. The students, unusually subdued in this unfamiliar environment, clutched their carefully prepared care packages. Mrs. Winters had prepared them well for what they might encounter: veterans of different ages with various physical and invisible wounds. Some may be in wheelchairs, she'd explained. Others might look perfectly fine but struggle with injuries we can't see, like Colonel Harrington did. As they entered the long-term care ward, Emily found herself walking straighter, chin by, up, shoulders back, the posture she had observed in Jack for 3 years. The Marines beside her noticed, exchanging subtle glances of approval. The VA hospital visit proved transformative, not just for the veterans who received care packages, but for Emily's classmates, who listened to stories spanning conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. One elderly veteran in a wheelchair had tears in his eyes as he accepted his package from Zach. "No one's given me a handmade card since my grandkids were little," he said, carefully reading the message Zach had written. On the bus ride back to school, Emily sat quietly, processing everything. The veterans' gratitude had been overwhelming, but what struck her most was how many mentioned feeling forgotten or invisible after their service, exactly what Jack had written about in his journal. 2 weeks after the VA hospital visit, Emily arrived at school to find unusual activity in the park. Several men in work clothes were installing something near where Jack's bench had stood. The original bench had been removed months earlier, deemed unstable by the city parks department. "What's happening?" she asked her mother, who smiled mysteriously. "You'll see after school," Maggie replied. "Captain Reynolds called yesterday. He asked us to meet him in the park at 3 o'clock. The school day crawled by as Emily's curiosity mounted. When the final bell rang, she rushed outside to find not just Captain Reynolds waiting, but all 12 Marines who had visited her classroom, now in their service uniforms. Behind them stood Mayor Wilson and several city council members, and there, where Jack's bench had been, stood a new one, made of polished teak, with a brass plaque on the backrest. "Emily," Captain Reynolds greeted her formally, "on behalf of the Marines who served with Colonel Harrington, we'd like to present this memorial bench to your community." Mayor Wilson stepped forward. The city council unanimously approved this installation. After hearing Colonel Harrington's story, it will serve as a permanent reminder of both his service to our country and the impact of Emily Monroe's kindness. Emily approached the bench slowly, reading the plaque's inscription, "In memory of Colonel Jonathan Jack Harrington, USM Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and in honor of Emily Monroe, whose simple kindness reminded him what he fought for. My smallest acts of compassion often have the greatest impact." Beneath the words was the Marine Corps emblem and the years of Jack's life. "Do you approve?" Captain Reynolds asked quietly. Emily nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She sat on the bench just as she had hundreds of times with Jack and ran her fingers over the smooth wood. "We wanted something that would last," Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz explained. "The Colonel's story deserves to be remembered." A small crowd had gathered, neighbors, school staff, parents, and students curious about the ceremony. Mayor Wilson gave a brief speech about community service and supporting veterans, but Emily barely heard it. She was remembering cold mornings, shared sandwiches, and Jack's rare smiles that had always felt like hard-won victories. After the official presentation, people began to disperse. Captain Reynolds sat beside Emily on the bench, both of them looking toward the school entrance as Jack had done so many times. "The Colonel's Marines have started something else we thought you should know about," he said. "Many of us volunteer with veteran outreach programs trying to identify former service members who are homeless or struggling with PTSD. The Colonel's story, and yours, has inspired what we're calling Operation Morning Bench." "What's that?" Emily asked. "Veterans helping veterans through simple, consistent contact, meeting them where they are, without judgment or pressure. Some of us simply sit on park benches in areas where homeless veterans gather, offering coffee and conversation. It's not a formal therapy program, but it's making a difference." Emily smiled, imagining Jack's reaction to his Marines sitting on benches across the country, extending the same quiet companionship she had offered him. "There's something else," Captain Reynolds said, reaching into his pocket. He handed Emily a business card with a Department of Veterans Affairs logo. "Dr. Sarah Jenkins, the mother of Private First Class Michael Jenkins. Remember her letter?" Emily nodded. She had read all the letters in Jack's wooden box multiple times. After losing her son, she went back to school and became a psychiatrist specializing in PTSD treatment. When she heard the Colonel's story, she reached out. "She's developing new treatment protocols based on what worked for him: consistent human connection in neutral settings, no pressure to talk, simple acts of kindness without expectation." "Jack would like that," Emily said softly. He wrote in his journal that traditional therapy felt too much like being debriefed after a mission. All those questions he didn't want to answer. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, more visitors came to see the new bench. Emily was surprised to recognize some of them. The kind barista who had sometimes given Jack free coffee, Officer Ramirez, who had kept an unofficial protective eye on their morning meetings, even the gruff Parks Department worker who had occasionally cleared snow from the path to Jack's bench in winter. "I never knew his name was Jonathan," the barista said, reading the plaque. "He always paid for his coffee with exact change, and sometimes he'd leave an extra $1 when a homeless person came in after him. He watched out for this neighborhood," Officer Ramirez added. "More than once he alerted me to suspicious activity around the school. Always disappeared before I could thank him properly." Each person had a story about Jack, small interactions that had revealed his character in ways Emily had never seen. The homeless man on the park bench had been more connected to her community than she had realized, touching lives in quiet ways that only became apparent in his absence. As the sun began to set, the crowd thinned until only Emily and her mother remained on the bench. Maggie put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked. Emily nodded, fingering Jack's dog tags beneath her shirt. "I think he would have liked this," she said. Not all the attention, but knowing he made a difference, not just in Afghanistan, but here too. 1 year later, Emily sat on the memorial bench, now weathered enough to feel natural in the landscape of the park. At 8 years old, she had grown taller, her face losing some of its childish roundness. Jack's dog tags still hung around her neck, though they now shared the space with a small silver compass, a gift from Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz on the anniversary of the colonel's passing. The morning was cool, spring flowers pushing through the soil around the bench. Emily unwrapped her breakfast sandwich, dividing it neatly in half, as she had done hundreds of times before. The second half she placed carefully on the bench beside her. "Morning, kid." The gruff voice belonged to Mr. Collins, a Vietnam veteran who had started appearing in the park 3 months ago. His beard was white, his weathered face lined with years of hardship, but his eyes, unlike Jack's haunted blue ones, were warm, brown, and often crinkled with humor. "Morning, Mr. Collins," Emily replied, scooting over to make room. "Breakfast?" The older man sat down with a grateful nod, accepting the offered food. Unlike Jack's early silences, Mr. Collins was chatty, full of stories about his time as a helicopter mechanic and his struggles since returning home. His left leg was missing below the knee, replaced by a prosthetic that sometimes gave him trouble. "How's the pain today?" Emily asked, noticing his slight wince as he settled on the bench. "Better than yesterday, worse than tomorrow," he answered, with his usual stoicism. Their morning routine had begun by chance. Emily continuing her habit of sitting on the bench before school, Mr. Collins passing through the park on his way to a part-time job at the hardware store. Their first conversation had been about Jack. Mr. Collins had recognized the memorial plaque and shared that he'd known the quiet colonel from occasional overlapping stays at the VA hospital. Now they met 3 or 4 mornings each week, sharing breakfast and conversation. Mr. Collins wasn't Jack, no one could be, but their friendship had its own rhythm and value. "Got something for you," Mr. Collins said, reaching into his worn backpack. He pulled out a small carved wooden box. "Made it in the VA wood shop. Thought you might use it for those tags you're always fiddling with." Emily accepted the gift with genuine delight. The box was simple but beautifully crafted, with her initials burned into the lid. "It's perfect," she said, immediately removing Jack's dog tags and placing them inside, where they nestled perfectly in the velvet-lined interior. "Figured the colonel would approve," Mr. Collins said with a nod toward the plaque. He was all about taking care of what matters. As they finished their breakfast, a familiar black SUV pulled up to the curb. Captain Reynolds, now Major Reynolds, following a recent promotion, stepped out in civilian clothes. His monthly visits had become another ritual, keeping Emily connected to Jack's Marines. "Mail call, Miss Monroe," he announced, approaching with a large envelope. "Letters from the Operation Morning Bench teams. Thought you might like to see the impact you're having." The program that had started with Jack's Marines had expanded to veteran volunteer groups in 12 cities, creating regular meeting spots where former service members could find connection without pressure or judgment. Emily's story, carefully anonymized to protect her privacy but with her permission, had inspired the approach. "Any word from Lieutenant Jackson's team in San Diego?" Emily asked, accepting the envelope. The lieutenant had been deployed again, but his wife was continuing his morning bench outreach in his absence. 3 new veterans joined their group last month, Major Reynolds reported. One of them hadn't spoken to anyone in over a year. Now he shows up every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork, just like Jack had, Emily thought. "How's the ROTC program?" Major Reynolds asked as they walked Emily toward the school entrance after Much consideration, Emily had joined her school's newly formed Junior ROTC program, not because she necessarily planned a military career, but because something about the discipline and purpose resonated with what she had learned from Jack. "I'm the best at drill," she admitted, without false modesty. The handbook says it's about precision and attention to detail, just like the colonel, Major Reynolds said with a smile. At the school entrance, they paused. Major Reynolds executed a crisp, if subtle, salute, their usual farewell gesture. Emily returned it with the precision she had practiced in ROTC, making the major grin. "Your form's improving, Monroe?" "I have good teachers," she replied. Inside her classroom, Emily found her usual seat transformed. A small display case had been placed on her desk, lined with blue velvet. A note from Mrs. Winters explained that the faculty had commissioned it for the one-year anniversary of Colonel Harrington's memorial service, a place where Emily could keep his medals and mementos at school if she wished. During morning announcements, Principal Garcia reminded everyone that applications for the first Colonel Jonathan Harrington Memorial Scholarship would be due at the end of the month. The scholarship, funded by Jack's Marines and supplemented by community donations, would support a graduating fifth grader who exemplified compassion toward others. At lunch, Emily sat with her friends, including Zach, whose initial teasing about her friendship with the homeless guy had transformed into genuine respect after learning Jack's full story. He now wore a memorial bracelet similar to the one Emily had worn at Arlington, but sized for his wrist and engraved with Jack's name and rank. "Did you finish your essay for the Veterans Day Assembly?" he asked between bites of pizza. Emily nodded. "Last night. It's about how you don't always know someone's whole story just by looking at them." After school, Emily returned to the memorial bench. She opened the wooden box Mr. Collins had given her, taking out Jack's dog tags and slipping them around her neck again. Then, from her backpack, she removed his journal, the one item from his personal effects that she carried with her daily, opening to a page marked with a pressed maple leaf, one Jack had given her during their second autumn together. She began to read his words aloud, as had become her afternoon ritual. She'd begun doing this after discovering a passage where he'd written about the therapeutic value of giving voice to difficult experiences. Today, Emily asked about my nightmares. Read. Such a direct question from a 6-year-old. I told her sometimes I dream about sand and noise. The truth, which I couldn't share, is that I dream about Rodriguez, Chen, Mackenzie, Williams, and Diaz, how they looked in their final moments. But today, for the first time in years, I also dreamed about my childhood dog, Rex. A normal dream. From before the war, perhaps this is progress. As she read, a young woman walked slowly through the park, pushing a stroller. She paused, noticing Emily on the bench, and approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Emily, the girl from the plaque?" Emily nodded, closing the journal. "I'm Lisa Diaz," the woman said. "Sergeant Carlos Diaz was my husband. He was one of the Marines who—" Her voice faltered. "One of the 5, Emily finished softly. "Jack, Colonel Harrington. He carried their names with him always." Lisa nodded, tears in her eyes. "I heard about this memorial from Major Reynolds. I was visiting my sister in the next town and wanted to see it." She gestured to the sleeping toddler in the stroller. "This is Carlos Jr. He never met his father." Emily moved over, making space on the bench. "Would you like to sit? I could tell you about the colonel, how I knew him." Lisa sat, adjusting the stroller beside her. "I'd like that very much." As the afternoon sun filtered through new spring leaves, Emily shared stories of the quiet man who had sat on this spot for 3 years, not the decorated officer who had fought alongside Lisa's husband, but the watchful guardian who had protected a little girl in his own way. In return, Lisa shared memories of Sergeant Diaz, completing another piece of the puzzle that was Jack's life. When Lisa eventually left, promising to keep in touch, Emily remained on the bench. She opened the journal again, turning to the final entry Jack had written just days before his death. Today I watched Emily enter the school for what may be the last time. My strength is failing. I've made the necessary arrangements with Davidson. The Marines will find me soon enough once I'm gone. I've left instructions about Emily, the small girl with an enormous capacity for compassion. My only regret is that I won't see the remarkable woman she will undoubtedly become. But I die with certainty that the world is better for having her in it. My final mission is complete. Semper Fidelis. Emily closed the journal as the sun began to set. Behind her, the park was filling with after-school children and parents. Before her, the school building stood solid and familiar. And beside her, though no one else could see him, she felt Jack's presence, straight-backed and watchful. All was on guard. She touched the dog tags beneath her shirt. "Semper Fidelis, Colonel," she whispered. Then, with a small smile, she added, "See you tomorrow. Morning, Jack?" Slipping the journal back into her backpack, Emily stood and walked toward home, her shadow stretching long behind her in the golden afternoon light. One small girl whose simple act of kindness had created ripples that continued to spread, bench by bench across the country. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs hope today.